We've often spoken of different behaviors in this group, and in the recognition that our external behaviors are a reflection of internal behavior. And then finally, all behavior is really about the will to survive or the attempt to survive, even if the behavior is self-destructive in the process. The root of it is somehow this, without thinking, just instinctively. It's just inbred in us to survive, of course, and blessed be survival. But when we begin to awaken, we examine the deeper behaviors and our capacity to actually stop behaving, to actually face death is what that means, because that's what it feels like. If I don't do this, I will die, I will suffer, I will lose. It's very brutal in that way. And today we're talking about maybe one of the most brutal behaviors, which is taking the power of our own survival and using that over someone else or a group of people, and usually in a brutal way. So that if I am to survive, or if I am to survive in the way I want to survive, I have to have a certain power over other people. This is, of course, we know this in our schoolyards. We discover this quite early with the way the schoolyard is ruthlessly a reflection of these primal drives, this primal drive to survive. And on the schoolyard, there is usually a bully, someone who has power, strength, maybe even position, and then uses that in a way to make others suffer, usually others who are perceived as different or weaker or needed for the bully's fulfillment. And then there is a gang that is built around the bully that actually supports the bully. So often the bully only has to show up and the gang does the work. And I think that's what we're looking at in a maybe simplistic way in our society. If we go back to slavery, when slavery came to America, it was clearly brought here so that a certain group of people could survive and could survive better and then better and better. And it worked for that. And so it's not that those people were thinking, the planter class, thinking, I will have these slaves so I can survive better and better. That's just the way we're made. We want to survive better and better, all of us. And then when some of us are enslaved by others, it becomes detached from the identity of myself as other, or the empathy of experiencing what it feels like to be in a position of suffering, what it feels like to have lost power. So, as always on these groups, our inquiries are to dig very deeply within our own psyches to see where these animalistic drives, thought forms, patterns of behavior appear, and be willing in at least a moment to stop. And of course, that means in a moment to not be concerned with survival, to not be surviving. Of course, it can be a fearful moment. We lose sight of all the steps that we have taken to survive. And we, in that moment, stop preparing to take steps in the future to survive. And then we're left naked to ourselves. That's a moment of awakening, a moment of recognition. From that moment, or in the light of that moment, all the behaviors, internal and external, that have fed survival arise to be met, to be examined, to be recognized as sources of unnecessary suffering. So often we are talking about the individual, but in speaking of the individual, we're always also speaking of the collective. There's finally no difference. And everyone on this call has somehow mysteriously, I say chosen, maybe it was choiceless for you, either choicelessly chosen to wake up to the unnecessary suffering that you are causing to yourself and by extension to other. And in the spirit of that, I really want for us to look at the powers that we have. And in speaking of slavery, the power that in this country, in America, and slavery has existed in other places probably throughout human history, because it is a powerful way of marshaling support for your survival, regardless of others' survival. That we look at it deeply and even suspend judgment for just a moment, because if you're judging it, you're not going to look deeply. The judgment is too painful. So it needs to be judged, but you put aside the judgment for this moment and really just tell the truth. What is your role in this primal activity, say in a schoolyard or in a community or in a nation or in an army or in a government? What is your role in supporting the brutal nature exemplified by the bully of controlling others' lives? Because it has been done, you have done it, you have been complicit, I have been complicit, we all have, because the proof is that we have this situation where racism, which is the source of extreme brutality, and it has been exposed to us. It was exposed to me in the 1960s, so that was a long enough time ago. It was exposed to our culture in the films of the civil rights protest and the brutality that was met with. And it was exposed to us in the voting rights bill and in the recognition that if we are in a democracy, if we're supporting a democracy, then all beings, male, female, of any color, have the right to vote. So all of this is in play, and yet at some very deep part of ourselves, perhaps we haven't met the bully's gang or the bully itself. And the opportunity is to meet that. How you have been safe in the protection of the bully. Well, let's say the bully is the dominant culture, or the bully is the white race, or the bully is the God, or the bully is the army, or whatever we're saying. We have somehow served that for our protection. And if that's in fact protecting all, it's natural. There are forces that are stronger than the weaker forces in all societies. And we do have a survival drive that is not trivial, and it's to be respected. But when it becomes brutality, and when it becomes the protection at the cost of another's life, or another not having protection, another being devalued so that my value goes up, which was the initial planter class, which was the dominant class of the South, which supported the slavery in America. And we had a civil war about that. And that civil war is still being fought in many ways because of a primary drive to get other to do the work that would kill me, to do what needs to be done that I can rest, to do the work so that I can live graciously, privilegedly. And we are privileged. And so there have been those who have gone before us, who have done the work, that somehow we are met here. And this is the point of choice. Choice is an act of freedom, and it arises regardless of your tendencies or your conditioning or the threat of choice. Maybe some people would call it a moral choice, but it is a choice that is in the face of everything that says don't choose. Stay back. You're fine. Nothing going to happen to you. It's a choice that recognizes itself in all. It's a choice that is as strong as a no as it is as a yes. It is a yes to the freedom to say no, enough. And everyone who's listening to this has that choice. You may not be aware of it. You may have thought you already made it, or that it was made for you by your parents. But I invite you to freshly examine in this retreat of stillness that we have together, in this call that we have. What are you choosing? What is your choice? Where does freedom of choice come from? If you are choosing with maybe even unconsciously, but still with the exclusion of some aspect of yourself or some aspect of the collective, then it's not a free choice. It's a limited choice. It's limited to your idea of yourself, which is conditioned, which has been taught, which has been believed, and which is in its own way enslavement. When I met Papaji and he asked me what I wanted, I was really surprised to say freedom. Just because it wasn't a word I used that much, I would have said peace or love or happiness, enlightenment. But I said freedom. I'm so happy I said freedom. And he said, stop doing anything. At first, that was too radical to really be understood, because I felt if I stopped doing anything, I would fall back into my past suffering, and that my present suffering wouldn't get fixed, and my future would be non-existent. So I was afraid. I was afraid to stop. When he saw that I had met that fear and I was willing to stop and I was actually still, he said, now find out who you are. Find out what doesn't come and go. Find the totality of yourself. When we're willing to open, which is the same as stopping, he could have just as easily said, just open. When you open, every aspect of your conditioning falls out. If it doesn't, you feel it as something closed. You open, it falls out. You stop, you are here. Who are you? Do you imagine that who you are is separate from someone else or something else? Something in the past or the present or the future? You recognize that those imaginings come and go. Who are you? What is always here? in the moment of opening wide enough, stopping completely enough, you can actually inquire, who am I? Are there any boundaries to who I am? You can discover from that inquiry that any idea of other is an idea that only has arisen in your mind for the protection, the perceived protection of your body. And then in a moment of being unprotected and free, you can discover that you must discover that you naturally discover that you are the totality of all. It doesn't mean you like all. It's not a question of liking. It's a question of recognizing. You don't have to like your foot to love your body and want it to survive. There may be aspects of yourself you don't like, but they are aspects of oneself. And when you recognize that you are whole, you naturally don't find an other to be a threat to that. So to me, these deep inquiries that we have here and that Papaji invited me to share with you are useless if they don't have some relevance to our lives as human beings. It's because we are human beings that we have the capacity, the mental capacity and the strength to inquire, to face death, to recognize our own complicity in brutality, our own hope that those who are brutal are actually taking care of us. And we have the history, the horror of the Holocaust, the horror of slavery, the horror of continuing racism and killing of Black people. We have the horror that goes on in poverty. And so there is this call for those of us who are called to awaken to the truth, to recognize that if we exclude what is perceived as other, whether that's called society or the world or them or it, then we stop our inquiry. And I am inviting you to let your inquiry be infinitely deeper. And I'm inviting you to participate here in offering your inquiry and your discoveries so that we can all deepen from that. We have each other, all of us. And if we stop warring within our own minds and with each other, there is the promise of what is realized in a moment of true opening and true surrender. That promise is revealed. I just want to say a word about democracy, because democracy is also up. And of course, when our founders here in the United States spoke of democracy, they were excluding Black people. But as we have evolved, we have recognized that democracy means all adults have the vote. And in that, it doesn't mean you always get the right people in, as we know from our last president. But we have the vote, we have the participation, we are not excluded. That's very different from a kingdom that may be ruled by a king, even a philosopher king, a good king. It's very different from a strongman kind of government, which we have on the planet now in many countries. Even if it's a benevolent strongman, democracy is very different. And it is actually a reflection of a deep spiritual state a state of peace, a state of surrender, where you recognize, oh, all aspects of myself are here. All aspects of myself have a voice and deserve to be heard. So I've spoken before in satsang for years, what a privilege we have to be able to meet like this. Then I was talking about having big meetings where we were gathering and a couple of hundred people would gather and we could speak freely, and how beautiful that is and how a reflection of a free society that is. So that's gone because we weren't free enough to fight a pandemic. We didn't have the power over a virus. And so we had to retreat, and we've had these meetings, which have turned out to be wonderful. What a privilege that we have these meetings. But if something happened to the web, if the whole thing was hacked, we wouldn't have these meetings. So it's always a privilege, and we never know how long it will last to be here with each other, to be in a particular human form, with the capacity to ask the deepest questions, the hardest questions, and often the least obvious questions, and to have each other as support for that. So while all of that can be taken away, what can never be taken away from you is your inherent beingness. And it's that which is supported here and offered here, that all being may awaken to itself, that all being may celebrate oneself, that human being may evolve to be true to the totality of itself in all forms.